Hello, everyone. I am Maria Palombini, and I lead the IEEE Standards Association Healthcare and Life Science Practice. For those of you who are not familiar with the IEEE, it stands for the Institute of Electronic and Electrical and Electronics Engineers. So we are a global organization. We have offices all over the world. We have 420,000 members in multiple different engineering disciplines in over 120 countries. So we have been around for about 100 years, and we have done many great things, but our main mission is advancing technology for humanity. So we're really excited to be with you today. Becky, who is the organizer of the Digital Innovation in Mental Health 2021 event, has asked us to present an exciting panel, and we've come together to present to you Changing Interface for Mental Health Care. It's a very interesting topic, and I'm really excited by the group of panelists that I have here today. So I'm going to quickly mention their names, but then I'm going to let you hear directly from them all the great work they're doing, and you will quickly see why we have asked this great panel to be a part of this session. So first with us, I have John Havens, who is the Executive Director of the IEEE Global Initiative on AI, Artificial Intelligence Ethics. I have Christopher Burr. He's an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. We have Mahscia, who is founder and CEO of Evrmore, and Elvira Perez, Associate Professor of Digital Technology for Mental Health at NIHR Nottingham Biomedical Research Center. So real quick, this session is interactive, meaning that I've asked the panelists not to present slides because I really want you to hear their expertise and how they're always thinking about challenges and situations that are impacting, obviously, more in the mental health space. So first, before we get into the crux of the great questions to bring out all this expertise, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to quickly tell you about what they're doing. So in same order, I'm going to ask John first, if you can share the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you, Maria, and thanks to Becky. A huge shout out to all the work that she's done in the past number of years with regards to mental health. It's really impressive, and so thank you, Becky, for the opportunity. And great to meet some new colleagues, Elvira, for instance, and then to be with friends like Chris and Ivy and Maria. So as Maria mentioned, I've had the pleasure and honor for about 5 years to lead what I think is IEEE's largest AI, or artificial intelligence systems, AIS we tend to call it, ethics-oriented work. And by lead, that really means kind of shepherd. We've created, and we is about 700 volunteers, a big document called Ethically Aligned Design that had 3 different versions. The first version came out in 2016. The second version, after 500 pages of feedback, came out in 2017. The most recent version in 2019. And we've been very honored to hear that multiple organizations, the OECD, UNICEF, IBM, have used that as a foundational document for their AI principles. It also inspired multiple standards working groups in something called the 7000 series. And we have a shorthand, we call it From Principles to Practice, how to move these principles into pragmatic tools to help organizations. I'll talk more about that later. The last thing I'll say is that the last chapter of Ethically Aligned Design, which was added about a year ago, is actually focused on extended reality ethics, and there was a lot of mental health issues there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now you, Christopher?
Yes, thank you, Maria. And thank you also to Becky for putting on the conference and for giving us all the opportunity to speak. As Maria mentioned, I am an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. I work with some people at Cambridge University, though I should point out I'm not actually at Cambridge University or affiliated with them myself. I think there may be a slight confusion there. And the work that we do at the Alan Turing Institute is quite varied. Specifically, however, I work within the public policy program, and the work that we do is trying to help local and public sector organizations think about what it actually means to, as John put it, put ethical principles into practice. Because various different domains, from say healthcare to education to criminal justice, will tend to sort of gravitate towards a specific set of ethical principles and specify or operationalize them in very different ways. And exactly how they then take those principles and put them into practice also has a lot to do with the various sort of forms of governance or skills and capacities that each of those different sectors may have. So our role, or at least one of our roles within the public policy program, is to help public sector organizations think about using data science and AI within their organizations in a responsible and ethical manner. And I think that's probably enough about the work that I do. The one other connection, I guess, to this panel is that starting this month, actually, I'll be working on a project exploring the use of data science and AI, specifically in mental health care, and also looking towards trying to develop good principles for governance in related public sector organizations. And to that extent, we'll be also working with the IEEE to think about how we can develop standards to allow designers, developers, deployers, stakeholders, patients all think about how you can go about assuring specific claims that are made about digital technologies and mental health care. Because often it's a matter of communicating that a piece of technology is designed responsibly, but if you're a patient trying to evaluate those claims, it can be quite difficult without having reliable standards that can be pointed towards by different stakeholders. So that's me.
Thank you, Christopher. And Ivy? Ivy, oh, so Ivy, you're on mute. Maybe you can unmute yourself, Ivy?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, now you're good.
Well, one note is to not mess around with your keyboard shortcuts right before the panel. Thank you for having me, everyone. It's great to really be on this panel because I live and breathe mental health. I'm the founder and CEO at Evrmore. Evrmore is the emotional wellness GPS for Gen Zs, and I'm happy to kind of deep dive into why that special segment in a minute. I have a 20-year background in consumer psychology and really am a product manager by trade, where right now really trying to focus, aside from just building an app for mental health, we want to build a social technology that can really help young people see their innate potentials and impact in the world. We would like to start building and continuing to build intelligent systems that can help us decompress our bandwidth for compassion, awareness, and life potential. There are too many other competing apps, not in terms of competitiveness, but really the apps that are inadvertently negating what mental health interventions can come about through technology. We're focusing on how to apply humanistic psychology and behavior change design in ways that is immediately usable and repeatable especially for young people. So the domains that I really draw on, and I think some of you guys already know this, is attentional engagement, AKA flow. Why that's important is because I think, again, meeting the psychology of young people these days, anything that's influenced or facilitated with a nod to game theory is very important. We're also really looking at behavioral science, digital psychology, meta learning, and of course, ethical implications in tech and AI.
Excellent. Very exciting. Thank you, Ivy. And finally, Elvira.
Thank you, Maria. Pleasure to be here. Lovely. And hello to Becky. Finally, Becky, we are in this space together. So I'm Elvira Perez. I work at Nottingham University as a professor, as an associate professor of mental health and technologies. And I'm based at the National Institute for Health Research. What I'm very passionate about is understanding how technology impacts and influences users' well-being and mental health. But I'm also interested in understanding how can we maximize the benefits of tech for well-being and mental health. So I look at both the risks, but also the potential. I'm also director of the TAST, the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub, that's funded by UK Research Council funding. And I'm, again, very interested in understanding how can we design technologies through co-production, through engaging with end users, stakeholders, to ensure that what the technology is not just trustworthy, but it has actually real benefits. In my day-to-day work, I engage both with children, young people, and older adults. And I always try to understand which are their user requirements, what is it that they want, and how can technology satisfy all those needs. So my work usually consists in translated all those user concerns and recommendations into policy change. And that's what I do.
Excellent. Great. So as you all can see, you can see very diverse, expert, very exciting panelists that we have put together today. So we're going to get started with our first question. Just to let the audience know, we are putting some links in the chat section for references, either papers or websites, things to help you find out more information about either some great work or just more research in this area. Hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of them by looking at them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to start with a very general question, which I'm going to ask each of the panelists directly to answer. So I'm going to start first with Ivy. In what ways are digital technologies changing our understanding of mental health and well-being?
Well, it's very hard for me to not answer that question from the lens of, again, what's out there in the market today, because we all kind of have to give a nod to sort of the natural evolution of this space. And I think at the very high level, there definitely exists a ton of opportunities, from new and interesting interaction models to other helpful frameworks. So in mental health specifically, we see there's definitely not any shortage of products that use, behavioral therapy frameworks or any kind of interventions. So the translation of those helpful frameworks for helping people a lot of times needs to be executed in a very mindful and thoughtful way, because most often we're essentially replacing what would have been an in-person interaction, right, mind to mind, to now machine to mind. And the other thing that I think is very exciting, and of course, all the caveat is with the opportunity that exists is a lot of pitfalls that we need to be looking out for, is sort of how can machine learning be leveraged to really get a good sense of the individual's current state, and then following that state in a meaningful way to inject or present the right opportunities and entry points to lower that barrier for intervention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ivy. And you touched on so many hot topics that we're going to talk about. So I'm actually going to ask Chris now to actually give his perspective on this topic, considering we already started to percolate the discussion of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is, I know, an area Christopher has been doing quite a bit of research. So how about for you, Chris? What do you think?
Yeah, I'll answer this obviously from my perspective as well, which I guess is also the reason why we're all here, right? To answer these questions from our own sort of perspectives and to sort of hopefully uncover some interesting differences and learn from one another. I guess I want to say two things, because like many researchers, I wear a wide variety of hats. Prior to starting at the Alan Turing Institute, I did actually quite a bit of research on digital well-being. And one of the things that I looked at with a few co-authors, including Professor Nello Cristianini at the University of Bristol and Professor Luciano Floridi at the University of Oxford, as well as others, was the way in which novel data-driven technologies are trying to bypass traditional methods of psychological or psychopathological assessment. So a traditional way in which an individual would be assessed would be using something like a questionnaire, where someone could go through sort of a set of items or questions that are designed to evaluate sort of an emotional state of the individual. Or if you go to a healthcare provider, they may do a more formal assessment with you. And the idea there was that it was always a trained professional that was using well-validated instruments to try and uncover something often sort of theoretically driven about the mental health and well-being of an individual. But the advent of machine learning algorithms and AI have led many researchers and developers to try and find alternative means for sort of helping people to understand their mental health and well-being. And there can be some pretty surprising ways in which this happens. The types of technologies that we use give rise to many diverse streams of behavioral data. And some of those are going to be nothing more than kind of strange correlations, which give very little insight for people, and more often than not are just allowing big social media platforms to advertise things to people based on some weak source that they pick from the data that the users leave behind. But in other cases, more advanced techniques that are well validated, that are carefully researched, can allow us to uncover how some of the new behaviors that we engage with through digital technologies like smartphones or social media platforms actually do uncover something quite interesting about our mental health and well-being. And sometimes this is a good thing. It can put power back into the hands of users and provide them with additional means for sort of self-realization, or I am a philosopher. So to use the point about that was often given to us by Socrates of knowing thyself, the ability to know ourselves more through technology. But there are of course dangers to this as well, because it's not always clear, for instance, why the use of a smartphone or the way that we interact with others online actually does say anything meaningful about our mental health. So to put on a slightly different hat momentarily, and just to draw this point to a close, one of the other things that we're learning or sort of beginning to understand about the way that digital technologies are changing our mental health and well-being is how little we actually know. And when it comes to advising policymakers or trying to design policies in healthcare or in education or other related domains, is the need to exercise caution, to do really robust, responsible research and innovation, and to make sure that digital technology is always there to support what is fundamentally an interpersonal relationship of care between humans. Technology can support that, but fundamentally mental health and well-being is often a social connection that we have to each other. And so I think it's important to recognize our own sort of knowledge gaps here, and to be sort of humbled by that, but also excited about the possibility of doing better.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christopher. And you, Elvira, I know you do quite a bit of research in this space. What ways are you seeing digital technologies change the understanding of mental health and well-being?
I think it goes along the lines of what Chris described, the proliferation of digital mental health interventions and apps, and we all agree there are too many, and probably they haven't been rigorously tested, so the user doesn't know what may work or may not work. But something that we've noticed is that the stigma around mental health has decreased. There is an acceptance, and I guess the pandemic has also brought that into our realities, that the stigma, well, it's not just the stigma, it's the understanding and the self-reflection around self-care, and I think that's a really positive step forward to engage with on everybody's or your own mental health. Technology has obviously there are so many there are lots of risks, and the complexity of the human mind is, I think we need to be a bit skeptical around the solutions that we can bring through digital means, because we also know that it's a human-to-human connection, what in many therapeutic contexts is what seems to bring that recovery forward. For me, a really interesting area is the way we are changing and the way we are accepting digital mental health solutions and technologies. If you talk with an older adult that is not tech savvy, will have a completely different experience and attitude than a child that has been born with a tablet, that has a virtual friend, and that connection with human to machine is evolving in a way that I don't think we can grasp, because we are already part of that more older group. And to me, it's fascinating to understand the attitudes and the perceptions of digital mental health interventions from different perspectives, and how that landscape is changing so rapidly. But there is a positive, which is I think the stigma is being reduced and access to therapy has increased massively, which I think are two very important points that we have to celebrate.
Excellent, very good points. And you, John, as well. What do you see as digital technologies changing our understanding of mental health and well-being?
It's a great question, and so many great insights already from everyone on the call. So I'll just list some things that struck me. One thing is, years ago, I wrote a book called Hacking Happiness about the quantified self movement, which was really not about AI per se, but more simple sensor-based wearables or tools that really were mainly about people getting to know themselves better. One example, I forget the name of the company, but there were simple sensors that just had accelerometers so that could recognize movement. And one insight that I thought was fascinating for seniors especially was that if you put a sensor on a bathroom door, and I'm going to get the percentage wrong, but it's something along these lines. If the bathroom door opens, I think it's 3 times more one day versus the next. It's a signal of like 75% or higher that there's some physiological change that demands instant attention in some way. Meaning it could just be always cleaning the bathroom, but it could also mean they've used the bathroom 3 more times. Similarly, the second sensor would be put on a drawer where the senior was asked to keep their car keys. And then, for instance, if that drawer didn't open, or a third one rather, on the pills, their medications. If those 2 drawers weren't opened, they then became indicators that certainly were both physical and then mental health. If the car wasn't taken out, was the senior not seeing other people, and then isolation can set in. So I bring that up because this isn't machine learning or AI. And in one sense, it's like if I just sat there and was like, Grandma, you didn't open your pills today, like that, you don't need some kind of like mystical technology. But the technology there in sync, the real thing that they sold, their market, that company, was to people my age, 52. My mom's 81, right? So I'm the person who's going to be monitoring, hey, Mom, are you okay? You didn't take the car out today, right? So it actually built connection between people. And this is something I wanted to talk about that Elvira mentioned, a lot of us have mentioned. A lot of my last 2 books, also the focus is on the science of positive psychology. And it's an empirical science for 30 years. Ivy mentioned the term flow, right? So instance, what you would do even if you wouldn't get paid. These have physiological effects. You do these things and your dopamine increases. But I bring this up to say one thing on this call, a couple of things just to be aware of. In general, I think we're all Westerners. Now, if I have any of that wrong, my bad. One thing is definitely true, we're all speaking in English. And I bring this up because a Western perspective on how mental health even starts a lot of times comes from an individualistic basis. That's not right or wrong. It's just kind of what it is, right? I have so many friends who are from the East, and that's a massive generalization, but meaning not the West, but in the global South, where especially in the positive psychology or sort of family structure of well-being, certainly in many indigenous cultures, being with other people, it's not a question, right? Individualistic aspects of how kind of the West rolls are just that. They're about the West. And so that this whole stigma sometimes around mental health, I find fascinating and devastating, because we have to convince people that it's a pretty good thing to be around other people to find aspects of well-being. So all that said, that's a fundamental core thing, because the quantified self movement and a lot of my work in general is first and foremost about saying, before technology, do you think you have worth as an individual with a community in your culture? Because that's a pretty key question before any sort of sense of what technology or sensors or whatever would you build on top of that. And then as part of that, then how can the technology help? And so things like, for instance, AI with soldiers with PTSD. And I want to recognize that any of the soldiers who might be watching this coming back from Afghanistan, thank you for your service. But that's something where typically I've seen a lot of the studies, the AI is sort of a first step to help, in this case, soldiers deal with the PTSD, where then they're introduced back into, as it were, dealing with humans. I think Elvira mentioned this, and this would be my last point. The thing about kids at such a young age being introduced to certain technologies, again, I think it's not about the technology, the bot, the chatbot, the AI chatbot, or the digital human, as it were, that could be speaking to them. A lot of early, at least, studies are showing a loss of agency and identity, where kids are even saying things like, I think that insert name of product here is smarter than me. And I think that speaks more to society and our universal parental and societal goals about how we want to advance technology for humanity, to say, are we advancing technology for humanity if our youngest humans don't feel any sense of self or identity and all this technology is swirling around them? I'm sorry, final point. We really need to talk about data, because how any of these technologies are used, something that is new with AI is that all of the data goes to the cloud. So if we don't have the opportunity to know ourselves as individuals or as part of a group, one thing to keep in mind is that, I think Chris touched on this, certainly hundreds and hundreds of advertisers do. They know everything we do. So it makes no sense for us to not have that same data to increase our well-being, and then also use it in parallel with what could be great opportunities to buy stuff.
Oh, so thank you, John. And as you can see, talking to the audience, is that you can see the panelists have a very, very passionate position on this very, very topic. And I just, again, want to remind all our audience to please check out the chat. We've put some links in there, and hopefully that'll give you some points to get more information. And as well, I would like the audience to think about these questions themselves. Just think about, as our panelists are answering, how these things are resonating with some of the research you may have done or some of the positions you may have taken in this area. So now I'm going to actually ask pointed questions to each of the panelists, and I invite the panelists to also, if they have a case study or expertise or opinion, to also jump in to make this session part very interactive. So Christopher, I'm going to start with you first. Of course, thank you for actually giving the title to this panel, The Changing Interface of Mental Health Care. But I kind of wanted to ask you, what exactly is meant by that phrase term, changing interface, and why is the concept important in the concept of mental health care?
Sure. I don't want to take all the credit for the title. It definitely came out of a conversation. In fact, conversations I've had with all four of you. So just one way of, I guess, providing a meeting space for the discussions we're all, I'm sure, excited to have. I'm actually going to riff off of John's final point in explaining this, because I think the final points you just made, John, do a really good job of emphasizing this. So, for instance, although it is important to focus on data here, and I'll come to this in a moment, ultimately technology provides many ways of interfacing with the world, right? So providing a means for interacting with our environment, and as a result of certain design choices that are baked into interfaces, there are certain flows of information that are made easier, and certain flows of information or certain forms of engagement that may be closed off. So you had a good example of the bathroom monitor. That's one flow of information. That's an interface between a door and some sort of notification system. I think one of the reasons it's important to focus on the notion of an interface in the current climate is because certain changes to technology and the way that certain things are prioritized means that we're sort of seeing these technologies now because of their data-driven potential. So if we think, for instance, back to, I think it was 2007, right, when the iPhone was initially released, it was by no means the first touchscreen device, but we all recognize that it was a pretty revolutionary device, which moved us away from that kind of slightly cumbersome, like, physical button interface, right, where previous sort of phones had either large keyboards or sort of dial pads, and it sort of set the agenda for what smartphones or this kind of new interface could be. But by having this massive screen, it forced developers to start thinking about, okay, well, how can my software now create new interfaces, right? How can the little sensors that John mentioned provide me with new ways to sort of give the users a chance to interact? So I had the pleasure of speaking with Ivy yesterday and hearing about the way that her app is bringing sort of voice-enabled elements to people, to the users to understand their well-being. I think that opens up new avenues. The problem, however, when we focus on some of the larger tech companies, and I'm going to name them, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, like the problem here is that many of the interfaces that they have developed are really there to allow them to collect more data. And it's not always clear how the sort of the new technology is giving rise to our data being collected in different ways. So I don't know how many people recognize that there's probably something valuable about the speed at which you scroll through something. That's obviously just one way that our smartphone's tracking how quickly we move our fingers up the screen. There's a whole project at MIT that's looking at something called the screenome, which is how users go from one app to the next. And ultimately, that's only possible because of the way that software interfaces on smartphone have enabled new forms of data collection. And this comes to the sort of the crux of the point I wanted to say, that if the more we understand this, the more we begin to realize that there are very acute risks, but also possible benefits. The risks are obvious, and I think this has been made clear to many, many people. But if you want to know, sort of dig into this a little bit more deeply, there's a very interesting 2014 study by a group of researchers working at Facebook who showed that certain sort of posts that were left by users could be used to infer their emotional state. And they tested something known as emotional contagion, which is if we send a load of sort of positive news stories to one set of users and a set of negative news stories to another, what influence does that have on their emotional state? And it caused a massive backlash, rightly, because most of these users didn't realize they were being experimented on in this way. But it also gave rise to lots of advertisers who thought, oh, okay, now we can potentially see what sort of effects maybe our adverts are going to have, and maybe we can collect more information, and we can then design tailored adverts that play on the emotional responses of users. For those of us who really care about using technology to enact a positive influence on people's health and well-being, this is just disappointing at best and kind of irresponsible at worst, especially when the sort of the new interfaces create new means for sort of transferring data that could, to go back to my previous point and also to connect up with John's last point, give us ways of understanding our health and well-being in important ways. But fundamentally, to reiterate the point I've made and to reiterate the point John and others have made, at heart of this has to be the sort of the interpersonal relationships we have with one another, because although data may help us understand the importance of that, ultimately it's going to be grounded in those kind of social relations we have with each other. And I'm cynical when it comes to whether or not large technology companies have those best interests at heart. Cynical is actually probably an understatement. I don't believe it for a second.
Great. So does anybody have anything they would like to add, or we can just move on to, I have so many great questions. I hope I can get to all of them so we can get to all the great goodies in these conversations. All right, so maybe I'll move it on to Ivy. John mentioned he liked the term you use, flow, and here it comes again. So interfaces control the flow of information between, say, a technological system and a user, and also shape how that user interacts with their environment. How could the design of these interfaces affect the mental health of the users?
Yeah, flow will be another series that we all need to do together. I think, and I'm kind of piggybacking on what John said about the context of culture and mindsets and mental models, right? Without going all the way up, I guess, like Google Maps, zooming all the way up to the 30,000 feet view of looking at East versus West, collective versus individualistic. I think when we start to think about affect the mental health of the users, affect as in providing timely interventions, that's very much context-based, right? Knowing the context of when the door has opened versus when isolation is in occurrence, or what are the other data points that can provide you a little more the richness of the situation, right? I think a lot of times, and this is not so much of an East or West conversation, it's more of a simplistic way of looking at mental health as in there are different schools. There's going to be a school that's all about chasing happiness, right? Happiness, you know, in the definition, going down to an individual basis, we all have a different definition for that. So in that sense, if we can just create a laser focus on mental health, being able to assess the right opportunities when preventive intervention can happen, then it means it's not so much about making people happy, because then let's go back to sort of how artificial intelligence usually is designed to deliver those goals. You know, if the objective function for your system is to just always make users happy, that sounds like a Black Mirror episode. It could easily become that, right? So I think, you know, the flow is first creating context, having a very intelligent way of laying out that context grid, whether it be full or fuller modo, sensing and assessing, you know, real-time states of the user. So then from those data points, you can start to infer and derive in whatever accuracy, sort of the situational context, the personal context, the psychosocial context, right? As it relates to a person's mental health state. And I think that gets into very interesting areas like emotion detection, right? Is it about accuracy, or is it just about creating enough pause and giving enough space when the user is thinking things through, or, you know, unpacking the day at the end of the day? The way for us to really affect or bring good outcome in mental health, preventive, I keep on saying preventive because I want to say that there's just a very unequal or imbalance of the mental health apps out there these days that's very much focused on diagnostics, which can get into a lot of issues with stigma. Preventive interventions can really happen when you start to really give the users the agency and the control of that flow of dialogue. And it doesn't necessarily have to be you're talking to an AI agent. It could just be something maybe a little more self-reflective. How can we make sure that first and foremost, it's that experience or that flow of information isn't hijacking the person's own narrative, right? The narrative, it needs, then that flow of information needs to be somewhat trauma informed. Life is full with trauma, micro, big ones, small ones. When that interface and that flow of information isn't sort of steeped in I think the science of it being trauma informed, that facilitation will ultimately fall short, and it will start to I think lead the witness in a way, right? It will start to become more linear. It will start to lose context of the situation, and it will ultimately, I think, just be robbed of its potential for actually creating opportunities for positive intervention.
Excellent point. It's very interesting. You know, we see a lot in the healthcare life science space when we talk about medical wearables and wellness wearables. The fastest growing population of these products is in obviously monitoring, right? And a little bit on diagnostics. So, but we never see them in the therapeutic sense. We never see them in, you know, the preventative sense, right? It's all about, well, you have the problem, let's just get more data out of it. And it's unfortunate. So I guess it's a good thing that we see that there is an opportunity here, right? We know there's a problem, and then we have an opportunity to try to fix it. Let's see. So, Elvira has some points that she would like to add.
Yeah, I would like to follow a bit on. I'm convinced that the interfaces are just going to improve. the machine learning, the AI, either for diagnosis, either for early interventions, either for prevention. I'm convinced it all will improve. But to me, and to be a bit controversial, that worries me. Because right now we complain that, for example, children and young people spend too much time on the screen. And we know that per se the technology is neutral, but when a child takes away sleep time and becomes sleep deprived, then obviously that has an effect on their well-being and mental health. So which are the contributors? And so the persuasive design of the interfaces, the more if they keep improving, we're gonna, and this is already a dilemma for many therapists. Parents arrive to the clinic saying, I'm really worried about my child, is a bit depressed, is not socializing. And then if the child is being given a digital intervention, that to me, it can be the beginning, because if that child is more comfortable with digital means, that can be a positive thing. But how much exposure are we promoting to engage with technologies, and is that healthy per se? Also, another issue around data. So when talking with children and young people, we know that they are a bit tired about e-safety, etc. But as soon as you start talking about data literacy, they are fascinating. And as soon as you show them what cookies are, how they're being tracked without knowing what happens to them, they become actually a bit of an activist. Oh, that's not fair. There's no transparency. There is, and I think education obviously is massive. And I'm hopeful, and I'm very positive into the looking into the future, that we will, the next generation of young people are going to be more familiar and more comfortable interacting with machines. But at the same time, hopefully they will be more aware, and they will be more knowledgeable about the opaqueness, what is not being seen around what happens with their personal data, and the power that big corporations have to manipulate not just children and young people, but society. And we've seen that very clear examples. So interfaces, yes, they are improving. The potential is amazing. But how can we, and again, that goes to the question about regulation, how we prevent over engagement and the danger of being too long online and interacting with technology, and not maybe with humans, which are by default more complex, more unpredictable, and probably a bit more annoying.
Excellent. Anybody else want to add to this point? Okay, great. So I'm gonna next go to you, Elvira. I think you're starting to lead down this path a little bit. We all know that the global pandemic has really exacerbated many existing inequalities. You know, we have seen everywhere the growing, the great digital divide, the healthcare disparities. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And this is not just in emerging economies, this is as well in established economies, you know, US, Europe, you know, anywhere that, you know, this is really another pandemic in itself when we talk about mental health care and challenges around that. So I think for you, the question really here is, as digital technologies continue to create opportunities for improved mental health and well-being, is there a risk of further widening the global, the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots?
So I'm supervising a student doing her PhD, Mel Wilson. She's actually focusing on understanding the impact of the pandemic and how inequalities have actually been more explicit, more evident. So for example, when the pandemic started, there were a lot of social programs ensuring that in each household, all children had access to a laptop or a computer. They thought that would be a solution. That's only part of the solution. If you just give a laptop to a family that is not teacher, or they don't have the knowledge to support the child accessing and setting the Wi-Fi, and it's quite actually more complicated than we think. So just making sure there is technology in everybody's houses, that's not just a solution. There are lots of issues, for example, about privacy. It's not having the space to do as a child, to do your homework in peace and silence, because there is not enough rooms and there is not enough shared equipment. So we know, for example, that during the pandemic, it was children and young people and older adults, the two groups that actually suffer the most. And the inequalities are becoming even more apparent, because it's not just having the means and having the knowledge, it's also having the social support to ensure, to enable the technologies to benefit users. And again, the social isolation that so many people experience, and it was sometimes trying to be counterbalanced with being connected online. And again, the education and the literacy around how to behave in that type of context, it has shown that not across society, not everybody had this benefit the same. And for example, what we've seen is that, for example, when therapists had to change their way of engaging with their clients face-to-face versus online, there were many safeguarding issues that they could not control. For example, in a specific situation where there is some domestic violence going on, if you are assessing your client online, you don't know if the perpetrator is around, if they are listening, in which room. So there are so many elements around, for example, online therapy that are difficult to control. And again, the more vulnerable seem to be the one that gets the harder hit. And I'll give you a very simple example. We know, and we have data that shows that young girls around 13 to 15 years old, their levels of subjective levels of anxiety and depression have risen significantly. Is it because social media? Is it because their way to engage with the online world? Probably these are only contributors. And when we look at those individuals specifically, we can see that maybe their family context is more volatile, or there is some trauma, there is some negative relationships. So the digital it will be a contributing factor, but there are again interesting elements from the technology. For example, the like button, which initially was designed, and I give this as an example often, it was designed to spread love. Well, it has become a source of anxiety for many young people. If you post something out there and nobody likes it, it can be very embarrassing and had a very fatalistic effect. That's a good example of how technology was designed for one purpose and end up having a completely different, unexpected result. That's why responsible research and innovation is such a key pillar of how we engage in the future development of new technologies. But definitely, the pandemic has made very explicit the inequalities that there are around the way we access as a society digital services, specifically mental health, definitely. And I can see Chris with his hand up.
Yeah. So
I
Chris, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something to sort of link this actually with the point that Ivy made earlier. It's kind of interesting in the climate where we're all social distancing, that there's another form of economic social distancing that's also happening, widening the sort of the divide between the haves and the have-nots, to go back to your question, Maria. So there's some interesting work in human development studies that was certainly heavily influenced by the economist Amartya Sen and the moral philosopher Martha Nussbaum, known as the capabilities approach. And this really, I think, sort of goes to what Elvira was just saying, that when we're sort of thinking about making interventions, designing policy, designing technology, it does matter that we don't simply put the resources out there. We also think about whether or not people actually have the means to sort of fully realize the capabilities that are present. And in some sense, there's a real difficulty here, because if the interfaces continue to get better and better and better, then those with the most means for realizing the capabilities are going to benefit from them just as much, if not more, as those who don't have the means for achieving them. So when we put out good work, and we really do sort of amazing sort of things with technology, there is a real risk that we're just going to be benefiting sort of a small minority at the top who already are equipped to realize the true capabilities of that. And so when Ivy talks about the sort of the psychosocial aspect of kind of mental health, I think that is really important, just because it does highlight the fact that if we really, really care about sort of rectifying inequality and reducing some of that digital divide, it isn't enough just to look at whether or not technology is helping people understand their sort of psychological component. As a society, we just have to do a lot more to support the most vulnerable. And sometimes that means designing policy that isn't necessarily going to be sort of like universally beneficial, but actually is just going to bring other people up to an appropriate level of threshold so that everybody can be sort of pursuing their own sort of conception of human flourishing.
Sure. John, you have something to add here?
Yeah, and how do you take off the little hand? How's that for technology? Lower hand. There we go. Okay. So many good comments. And first of all, just the term flourishing, I'm really glad Chris used it, and Ivy's points about happiness. In the positive psychology world, and if people don't know that, basically traditional psychoanalysis, Freud and Jung, the logic is, as a person, you might have pain, and like a vase that's full of water, can you remove that pain? And great, right? I mean, I'm being very simplistic, but that's a goal. Positive psychology says, what about the positive affect that you can then help train someone? This to me is 8 years ago, and my dad was a psychiatrist. He's passed away, but I was raised with a psychiatrist. Now, granted, he couldn't really talk about his work, but the stigma of that I'm 52. So as a young person, people like avoided him like he was like a magician, you know, he's like a scary magician, you know? So I say all this to say that I find it fascinating in 2021. If I say to anybody, hey, have you gone to the gym? Are you eating healthy? People are like, and like, guess what? That's how you get more healthy physically. People are like, thanks for the deep insights. But especially in the West, in my experience in the US, permission to even think about that mental health in some way has actions that could be used to increase long-term what's called flourishing, right? And in positive psychology, flourishing, I'm really glad Ivy talked about this, is not only the ephemeral, momentary, mood-based happiness, right? Which is part of who we are. It's our emotions. But flourishing, flow, things like the flow state, maybe for an athlete who's at the peak of their performance, they're not happy. Like at the middle of like an Ironman marathon, you're not gonna like run along with a mic and they're like, I'm happy. They're like miserable in one sense, but they're doing what they feel they were born to do, right? And I bring this up because one thing I really think is critical to touch on in this conversation, having also been an EVP at a top 10 PR firm, right? All marketing has one purpose: to get you to click and buy something. That does not need to be put moralistically as being evil or wrong, but it must be centralized in these conversations, because there's two things, whether we want to call it obfuscation or whatever, distraction. I think it's at such a deep level. For Americans and Westerners, I think it's at one deep level because we have not been trained to ask, if I have worth beyond what I can buy, what are the needs that aren't being fulfilled? That's not the message that we're given. The message is boom, 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 boom. You just did something, and maybe this will make you happy. Short-termism is probably in modernity, and I'll speak mainly for English-speaking Westerners, the number one thing that I think is the negative cause for mental health. I mentioned it 7 times. I'm not sure why I need to say my age so often, but I'm 52. Guys my age in America and Japan, and Marie, you can correct me if this stat is wrong, but I knew 6 months ago is correct. The number 2 leading cause of death for men my age is suicide after heart disease. And obviously suicide is a choice, being deeply focused on, sensitive to that. Yesterday, 2 days ago, driving to the pool, I heard a new stat on NPR, a new report that came out that kids in the US ages 5 to 11 Suicide has increased by 15% in the past 2 years. Young people ages, I think it's 18 to 25, suicide in the US has increased 50% in the last 5 years. So I think a core thing that we have to ask is, and again, this is not me, I want to be crystal clear, being negative towards any company, but it's a key awareness that we have to have in all these conversations, which is one, if companies, their mandate from shareholders, et cetera, is to increase a single bottom kind of quarterly line, that is a short-termism based design modality. It's just what it is. Did I say it was evil? Did I say companies are bad? No, I have certain feelings along those lines, like Chris. But I'm trying to wrap up quickly here, except to say that, like, foundationally, the constraints of the system's thinking around mental health, things that are just fact. A, we don't have control and access to our data, all humans. So we are all marginalized. We are all vulnerable, certainly more populations in certain ways. But the point is if we can access that data, anybody can access and do what they really want with it. So that's foundational. The second thing is where the system is designed for us to have the short-term dopamine hit, long-term flourishing is not the issue. Long-term flourishing is often not along, like with flow I mentioned, it's by stuff that would be considered, quote, kind of boring at times, meditation, whatever else. It's not about short-termism. But I bring that up because if those things aren't talked about in the same place as saying, why has suicide increased? And does society value that people don't, again, I want to be very sensitive to say that suicide has so many factors, but in general, for me, I think it's an indication of any society. If people are choosing to remove themselves, they have a deep sense of loss and grief to not stay, being very simplistic. And if that's the case, a first priority should be, outside of getting someone to buy, outside of short-termism, outside of only metrics that prioritize that short term, how do we keep people feeling that they have worth and staying around? If that becomes the priority for design, then that also gives permission to companies and whoever else to say, along with the short-termism and all the great technology, advertising based, that we can get to get people to do these things, then we can use that same beautiful mentality for all that stuff and shift it to say, how do we keep people feeling a sense of worth and make that the number one priority? I wouldn't understand how any society would not say, we want to get you to buy stuff, we got to make money, cool, and our stuff is cool, amen. But if the real question is not asked how to prioritize mental health and design, then I don't know what definition of a, quote, good or positive society anyone would have.
I think those are all good points. And I think we have time for one more question. But before I do that, I just want to say on the point of inequality in healthcare inequity or healthcare disparity, I feel like we need a standard just for the term of this. It impacts every point and phase of the healthcare system, from R&D, research and development, through healthcare delivery. Healthcare disparity impacts every point, meaning that we can't really develop therapies. There's a lack of the integration of data. We can't help people who are sick. We don't even know how they're sick, when they're sick. We get them too late. I mean, it is just, talk about a pandemic across the entire, and this is a global challenge. And so it is not a shock to see it obviously impacting the mental health care space as well. But with that, so Chris brought up, he threw it in there, the Facebooks of the world and the Googles and everybody else, that Instagrams and everybody else in this world of tech and everybody socially gathering in this space. And John has been bringing up to me in the last week something very interesting that's really, I think, piqued his interest. And so I bring this question to John. What does it mean to have mental health in an immersive or general setting when Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, just said he wants to build the metaverse? What exactly are we talking about when it comes to humanity within the immersive web?
I just talked for a while, so I'll try to make this quick, and then I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts, Maria, if we have time. And I always say that, and then I talk for like 14 minutes, so enjoy. The metaverse is a term coined by a guy named Neil Stephenson, a science fiction author, and a fantastic nerd book, and I say that with love because I am one, called Snow Crash. And it was written like 20 years ago. It really predicted what augmented and virtual reality would do. So if people who watch this aren't familiar with what immersive reality means, it simply means that, for instance, And Elvira, I think, talked, about gaming, for instance, before. It's interesting in terms of when people say young people are in games, et cetera, which is true, but people my age, men, women around the world, are also in games. It's, I think it's at least 2.1 billion active gamers in the world, and active meaning 40 to 50 hours a week. So if you put on a headset or you're even looking at a screen and you spend 40, 50 hours a week in game, my point here is that you're already in one sense, the metaverse. That said, if you've seen a movie like Ready Player One, which is one of my favorite books, the logic there is that you are fully immersed almost all the time in that type of augmented or virtual setting, where then, except for needing to use the restroom or eating, and even there, like a la the Matrix, you can have tubes pumped into you and stuff. That's a little science fiction-y, but right now, all of us as adults, probably on this call, we're probably kind of immersed 30 to 40 hours now anyway, right? But the metaverse logic, Mark Zuckerberg was saying that Facebook is building, which I've known for years. He bought Oculus Rift. Their company bought Oculus Rift, which is a VR headset. And the main thing here, and we can, again, Maria, if we can put it back to everyone else, is how will the world look different? And I'm keenly aware that it's going to be 5 or 10 years till most people could afford headsets. Access to the headsets are going to be whatever. But keep in mind that with augmented reality, if I was wearing glasses right now that had, it's pretty simple. It's just wearing a smartphone on your face. It's not like this complex technology. I could be talking to all of you in any environment and have information. Christopher Burr works with Oxford. Here's the last thing he wrote. Here's what someone said about him on Twitter. Oh, I guess he's a really cool guy. I got to suck up to him, right? All the things in real time affect mental health. And we're pretty close to it right now. But if certain companies, and again, not picking on Facebook per se, but are the conduit to all of reality, right? You put on that headset, and however Facebook defines data access, however Facebook defines privacy, then that means pretty much literally Mark Zuckerberg designs humanity's future, as in the identity and how we approach identity, and certainly things like mental health. So anyway, I have a lot more stuff I could say, but Maria, I feel like I'm bogarting your call. And my main point here is, with all the mental health experts online, on the call rather, what does that look like when all these questions become framed with the de rigueur place that we start our day is that immersive world?
So does anybody, since this is our last question, and I did have another full list of questions for everybody, but I didn't want to hijack Becky's full conference. So anybody have any comments to add to this point? Metaverse.
And I like the, I'll be short because I want Elvira and Chris to also kind of chime in here. It's another series, so we need to schedule that. I think it really comes down to, for the metaverse to not get too twisted, right? I do think of it as inevitable. It's already kind of on its way there. We're just in, let's just say, iteration 0. It's about creating checks and balances in the system. So how are we looking at it from an accountability perspective, from a self-sovereign perspective? My experience is my data happening within the universe, aka all different versions of life, digital or in real life life. How are we having the control of self-sovereignty to say, I can say these things actually happened, and yes, that represents me in all of my emotional states, touching a little bit on mental health, or yes, that is my professional avatar or personality, and this is kind of like my personal framework. So I feel like if, let's say, that chain of command is completely not touchable by the end user, then that is a complete loss of the agency, right? And it just becomes only messier from that point forward. So I know sometimes I admit this, right? This is real. I do a little bit of internal eye roll when I hear people talking about blockchain, because it's so far so attached to cryptocurrency and other stuff, but it has its uses in really providing that protective pathway for us to start really owning our identities, multiple, plural identities in the metaverse.
Oh, blockchain, that could be a whole nother conference. Chris,
Right.
did you have a point?
Yeah, can I chime in, and then I'll hand over to Elvira to provide, I guess, the sort of the closing remarks on this topic. Aside from our collective interest in mental health, I overlap with each of the other three panelists in other specific ways. So, John, I'm very much not a cool guy. I'm a massive sci-fi nerd like you as well. Ivy, we recently realized that we both share an interest in embodied mind and mindfulness. And Elvira, you and I both know that we're very passionate about responsible research and innovation. And so I want to try and give an answer that touches on all three of these things. In relation to I guess, a kind of a lingering question about AR, but more specifically VR and fully immersive environments like the Ready Player One example that John alluded to. So we really don't know a huge amount about how our brains, our bodies, and our environment all interact in this really complex, dynamic way, especially when it comes to developmental psychology or sort of early kind of understanding of cognition. And there are some interesting experiments related to embodied cognitive science that highlight how important the interaction between our sort of developing and quite plastic brains interact with our bodies as they in turn act within certain environments. And admittedly, there are some fairly nasty experiments involving two kittens, one of whom was allowed free roam of an environment during sort of the formative years of its life, and it could walk around, it could play, while another one had, I don't know which sort of pathway severed, so that it could see everything that was coming in, but its actions were determined by some clever mechanism where the other kitten was basically strapped to some device that was also strapped to the other moving kitten. So the one that was unable to move had its perceptual input determined by the movements of the other. And it turns out, unsurprisingly, that the inability to move for that smaller kitten really severely impacted the way that its perceptual system developed, and subsequently, unfortunately, led to that kitten's death. Now, the reason I raise this is because it highlights something quite interesting about the way in which our brains, our perceptual systems, like vision, are so dependent upon how we learn to interact with our environment. And up to now, our environment has been the physical environment that we are born into, not a VR immersive environment that is going to have very different ways of providing feedback to our sort of systems. Now, for well-developed brains, what sort of mature brains of adults, maybe that's not much of a concern. But for younger developing brains or adolescents, we just don't know the impacts that sustained periods of time are going to have on a sort of a child or an adolescent's cognition. And so finally connecting this to the responsible research and innovation point, and then handing over to Elvira, is that an important consideration about being responsible in relation to research and innovation is trying to reflect and anticipate on unintended consequences. And so as we start developing more immersive environments and using VR, it is absolutely imperative that we set mechanisms into research and development that make room for the fact that there will be unintended consequences, because we just don't understand that much about our cognitive systems yet. And it is a bit of a concern as we start creating these very persuasive, very engaging, somewhat potentially addictive environments when we don't quite know the effects it's going to have on people's brains, cognition, and of course, mental health. And with that, I don't know if Elvira wants to say anything about responsible research and innovation, but hopefully I've given a good segue to her if she wishes to.
Yeah, Chris, yeah, I don't think I have much to add. So fantastic summary. And I agree, are we reflecting enough? Are we trying to anticipate the long-term effects? And I'm fascinated by the advances in augmented reality, immersive VR. It's amazing, and the experience is great. And I can identify a few very good examples of VR applied to support those that have phobias with insects or heights, and it seems to work. But what really I keep saying it worries me that, for example, Facebook now they are working on this massive project called Area, where it's again similar to the Google glasses, but it seems that it's going to be improved and the glasses actually aesthetically are going to be better. So I wonder if we start adding excitement to our reality through a specific pair of glasses, what happens when you take them off? Is our reality exciting, and or do we start becoming depressed and bored because the excitement of that illusion isn't there? And I think, and again, I worry about where our children, how our children are engaging with that type of technology. They are getting used to it, and once you remove that, is life exciting enough? Once you get used to that vibrant and the personalization is amazing, because, for example, with these specific glasses, you can add anything you want to your life. You will be seeing it through your eyes, and once that's taken away, is life exciting enough? I don't know. It's a more a philosophical question, but I worry about the lack of reflection and the lack of responsibility in developing this amazing piece of technology. And I'll pass it to Jan. Sorry, yeah.
Well, Elvira, thank you so much. And this has been such an exciting panel. Like I said, we could probably take in another 6 hours, but in the spirit of time and people's attention. I want to thank all of you, the audience, for watching us. I want to thank Becky for giving us the opportunity to present this session to you all at the Digital Mental Health Innovation Conference. Again, we hope you can come and join us. Christopher is actually going to be leading an incubator program here at the IEEE Standards Association on this very, very topic. He's covering many important things, but the actual topic of the incubator is ethical assurance of data-driven technologies for mental health care. And by incubator, we mean that we bring people together to collaborate, look for opportunities for maybe potential standards development in data or tech standards, open source standards, or just the opportunity to work together and maybe do a white paper, gap assessment report, whatever it may be, to move the needle forward in addressing these critical challenges we have, obviously, in the healthcare domain. So with that, I want to thank you, the panelists. You guys were awesome. I'm so excited that you agreed to participate and put it all on the table, your passion, your expertise, and we are really, really appreciative. And I wish all of you to continue to stay safe and well. And hopefully next time, maybe we can do this face to face. So until then, stay well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you for sharing, Maria, as well, and for putting it all together.
Thank you, Maria.
Yes,
absolute pleasure.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.